It is now November. I'm not sure how exactly that happened. We're 6 days away from Election Day, and if you're like me, as our great president says, don't boo, vote. If you're like me, this face has been haunting your dreams for the last few months. And when I wake up in the middle of the night in a cold sweat and stare into the darkness of my bedroom, I spend a lot of time wondering, like I'm sure many of you do, how did we get here? How is it possible that a reality TV star is this close to the presidency? And there's a valid answer to that question, which involves, the history of the Republican Party over the last 40 years, how they've chosen to perpetuate themselves. But that's not a complete answer, and it's not the one I want to focus on today, because it certainly doesn't explain how or why this populist backlash has become a global phenomenon. We've seen it in the UK over the summer in Brexit. We've seen it in the Philippines with the rise of President Duterte, who's sort of his own mini Trump. We saw it in Colombia recently when the Colombian people rejected a peace deal with FARC. So this counter-institutional sentiment has taken hold globally. Trust in institutions that got us through a pretty tumultuous 20th century, is as low as it has ever been. And it's in part driven by a failure of elites, the elites who are responsible for maintaining these institutions and make sure they operate fairly. And I'm not sure if any of you are familiar with this book, but I highly recommend it, by Chris Hayes, Twilight of the Elites. He argues that what we see as sort of this backlash against institutions has been largely a failure of elites to steward the institutions that should be cornerstones of our society appropriately. But it's also rooted in a general sense that institutions just don't work for us anymore. And that sense is very much tied to the major technological shifts we have experienced in the last couple of decades. The individuals are now equipped to do just about anything from the palm of their hand. I'm sure many of you out there are doing something from the palm of your hand as I speak, and I don't hold a grudge. Yet many of the institutions that got us through the last century have been unable to keep up with this technological change. And the structure of dominant institutions tends to mirror the communications technologies available to them. So in the 20th century, dominant institutions were organized like this, like hierarchies. There was sort of command and control structure, centralized power, one-way communications channels, and by one way I mostly mean top-down. A lack of feedback mechanisms, certainly not responsive in real time, and there was a very high cost to entry. So these were also the defining characteristics of communications tools in the 20th century. There were very few ways for citizens to actively participate in public debate. They could write a letter to the newspaper, they could vote, they could protest, and protest is actually really important, we'll come back to it. But it's very difficult for people to connect to each other across the hierarchy. There were very few opportunities for people to speak up the chain, but there were even less opportunities for people to speak across the chain. About 20 years ago, as we know, that all started to change. The 21st century, and I believe probably a few centuries to follow, will be dominated by new institutions that are defined by networked organizational principles that mirror the structure of the internet itself. And this is a map of the internet a while ago. It's much bigger than that now. These institutions are decentralized. They push power to the edges. They allow anyone to speak and build a following at extremely low cost. They're creating two-way communication channels. They let ordinary people challenge the status quo. And perhaps most importantly, they allow people to connect with each other without a mediator. And that shift from hierarchical organizational structures to networked ones is the dominant theme of the current era, the era that we're living through. And I think it underlies all of the angst that I mentioned before. And while I think it's actually a positive change, ultimately a positive change, it has clearly been deeply destabilizing for the institutions which are the cornerstones of our society. Religion, media, journalism, government, military, education, and of course, arts and cultural institutions. All of them are struggling to come to terms with what this shift means for their role in the world. And it has enabled as much bad as it has good. So I want to acknowledge that this is a scary time. It's a time that creates spaces that are easy for demagogues to step into. And you start to see how we got here. The question is, and the question for you guys, is what we're going to do about it. So one answer is we can shut it down. Let's go back to the good old days. That's the backward-looking answer. That's the fear-based answer that brought us Trump and Brexit. The forward-looking answer is, let's build responsive institutions that take advantage of new technology and enable the freedom and ingenuity they create to flourish. Now, this doesn't mean completely doing away with the old, but in order to restore trust in our cornerstone institutions, we have to identify the values that made these institutions important in the first place and figure out how we breathe new life into them with this new tool set that we have available to us. And to borrow from one of our sister industries, this kind of angsty conversation that's been happening in the media sector, it's not about how do we save newspapers, it's about how do we save journalism. So the question that I will ask you, and I hope that you will take back to your institutions, isn't how do we move museums into the 21st century, but how do we create institutions that allow the values that you care about, creativity and culture, history and curiosity, to thrive in an authentic way in the 21st century. Now again, I don't really know much about museums, except that, of course, I adore them and I visit them as often as possible. So I'm not sure what the answer is going to be for you. I don't know what you're going to come up with. But I'm going to give you some examples from my experience working in a couple of institutions that are shifting into the 21st century. Government, through my work at Code for America, and campaigns through my work on the Obama re-election campaign in 2012, in hopes that some of those tactics will translate for you. I mentioned protest earlier, and I said we would come back to it. There's something really interesting about the fact that in the age of the internet, protest and mass movements are still such an effective tactic to challenge the status quo. And that's because the values of community organizing are very similar to the values that the internet was founded on. And the tactics that community organizers rely on are exactly the characteristics that define the internet. So this is a diagram from the Obama campaign. You can't really read what's on here, but it's really the shape that's most important. This was the basis for President Obama's election in 2007 and 2008. It's why he won Iowa. This is what we call the snowflake model. And it is, as you can see, at scale, when you extend it across the country, looks a lot like the map of the internet. And this is why the Obama campaign was so good at incorporating technology, because the tools fit the strategy so perfectly. So this is less about how do you do digital well. I want you guys to put on your community organizer hats for a minute and think about how you become networked organizers and how digital tools can help you achieve those goals. So I'm borrowing a bit from the methods we used in the Obama campaign, as well as from some of the work I did at Code for America, working with city governments who are not moving into the 21st century so well. And I'm going to run through 4 elements of this method and share some examples. I'm hoping you can draw some lessons that you can apply to your work. So we'll go through them. First, know your audience. This probably seems pretty obvious to you, but you must know who you're trying to reach. So who specifically? And a good place to start is by knowing who you're not reaching already. How many of you guys at your institutions have a sense of who's visiting on a demographic basis? That's great. And how many of you guys are using that data in some way to figure out who you're not reaching? Fewer of you, but still a good number. Okay, so this is great. So you guys are doing some of this work already. In city government, like I said, they're still trying to figure this out. In 2015, when I was at Code for America, we worked with the city of Boulder to help them increase representation in their long-term housing planning process. And in their minds, that meant if we get more people to show up, that means we have greater representation. But when they looked at who was actually attending the housing meetings, they found that they were overwhelmingly homeowners, even though 52% of the residents of Boulder are renters. And knowing that allowed us to very quickly focus in on where our outreach was going to be so that we could target renters. And this is just a fun little tool that if you're not using, I highly recommend it. It's called Census Reporter. Is anyone using this already for anything? Okay, it's so much fun. Not even if you don't want to use it for work, just go play around on it. It's if you're kind of a data and geography geek like me, you will love it. It gives you great data from the census. It's straight from the census about any geographical area. It allows you to compare your community against the community at large to see who you might be missing. So in Boulder, what we did was just count the people who were showing up at their meeting and ask them if they were homeowners or renters. And then we looked at the census data, which gave us a good benchmark against which to measure whether the city of Boulder was getting a representative set of people to show up at their meetings. And this was not something they were doing before. So if your goal is to have the the user base, the community at your museum to mirror your community, this is obviously a really great tool to use to benchmark that. We obviously did a lot of this sort of who are we reaching work on the campaign, and campaigns have taken targeting to a whole new level. How many of you are getting phone calls from campaigns these weeks? Yeah. Well, those of you who aren't, you have been determined to not be persuadable. So you should be excited about that for some reason. There's something about you that campaigns are not going to waste their time on. I don't know if that should make you feel better or worse. But some people are kind of creeped out by how much campaigns know. I tend to think about it and maybe this is just because I know how it goes on behind the scenes. But this ability to target voters and talk to them on their terms, so you tailor your message as most relevant to your audience, is actually kind of a breakthrough in how we think about campaigning. And that leads us to our second skill. Once you know who you're trying to reach, you need to meet them on their terms. So this means talking with them in an authentic way, using messages and messengers that resonate. And I hate to use this example because it actually makes me feel really old. Does anyone know who any of these people are? Glozell, Todrick Hall, and Sam Swee? Oh, okay, one person. All right, well, you're planning the party tonight. We're gonna all go out with you. But these are voices that a certain hard-to-reach demographic find to have authority, and campaigns are now really tapping in to get them to speak to those undecided voters that are very hard to reach. So I'm just going to play a video so you get a sense of how this looks in action. Now, remember, this is a political campaign for President of the United States, the most powerful position in the world.
What's up, everybody? It's Todrick, and I'm here in Philadelphia, where today I'm surprising a fan of mine. She's a very special fan. Her name is Brianna, and she sent me a video saying that she doesn't know if she's voting. I'm partnering with Hillary for America because I want everybody to come out and vote, and I want everyone to make the right vote. And I believe that the right vote is Hillary Clinton. All right, everybody, this is the moment. I see Brianna coming up. Let's do this. Hi. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm good. You gorgeous thing.
No, you're gorgeous.
So nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too.
Thank you so much for coming to do this. Oh, stop. Listen, I watched your video, and first of all, I love you. We're gonna be best friends. But I heard that you said you were thinking about not voting. You were like on the fence.
A little bit.
I came to give you some clarity, honey. This whole video is all for you.
What?
I just want you to sit back, relax, and enjoy it, baby.
Don't think you're in this alone, no. We can make the world better, stronger together. But you've been chilling all day at home, taking all these selfies with your phone. Well, that just won't do. This one's for so you gotta show up, let your voice out. This is what democracy's about. It's up to you. Everybody will be there, red, white, and blue. It's up to all voters.
listen, it is so important that everybody watching my videos, that we all go out and vote. And so, I'm here, Todrick Hall, out of breath and all, with a patriotic proposal to you, Brianna. I've never voted in my life, and you haven't either. Will you join me November 8th for voting for Hillary Clinton?
Of course I will.
She said yes! I think this is an emergency and that everybody that is watching this video needs to stop what you're doing and vote. And now more than ever, every single person's voice and opinion counts in this country. And I believe that Hillary Clinton truly represents what this country is about. Since Beyonce isn't running, she's the only obvious choice.
You're gonna have that song stuck in your head all day now, too. Trust me. So meeting people on their terms also means finding the right spaces to engage them. These are places where they feel safe. And we obviously did a lot of this on the Obama campaign. Actually, this is a barbershop here. We started a program, an outreach program to barbershops and beauty salons in 2008, which we saw a lot of success in. But that doesn't just mean physical spaces. We raised, do any of you Redditors who remember this happening in 2012? We raised a lot of eyebrows in 2012. Back then, when doing something like this was kind of edgy, when we had the president do a Reddit AMA, which stands for Ask Me Anything. And this is a kind of long-standing tradition on the Reddit platform where famous people will come on, and the idea is you can ask them anything, and in theory, they're supposed to answer any question. It was we kind of freaked out, the communications team, but the president decided he wanted to do it because it gave him credibility with a certain demographic that was harder to reach through traditional channels, and it made him more accessible than you can be in a traditional campaign setting. And of course, Bookmobiles, these are just my favorite because I love librarians. Are there librarians here too? Yeah. Great. You guys are... Yes, we all love you. And folks from any industry, not just museums, could do worse than to take some examples from what's happening in the library space in terms of moving institutions into the 21st century. Librarians have definitely been ahead of the curve, and the Bookmobile is like a 100-year-old maybe thing that ever since cars existed, librarians were thinking about how to get books out into the community. So once you've found your audience and met them where they are, it's not enough to just say hi and leave. Probably the most important element of the networked institutional age is this two-way nature of communication. And so in order to build trust, you need to build a relationship, and that requires conversation. So you need to think about how your community can be in conversation with you. And obviously, social media is a great tool for that. I feel like I don't need to spend a lot of time on this one because you guys are so steeped in it. But to the extent that you're able to convince leadership in your institutions that they also need to be open and engaging and in conversation with their constituents, this is a really important element. And then last, and maybe most importantly, and sometimes the hardest to figure out how to do well, is that you have to create meaningful opportunities for people to participate with you. You have to give them something meaningful they can do. And it doesn't need to be major, right? In Oakland, where I live, the Code for America Brigade repurposed a tool that had originally been built in Boston that allowed residents to adopt fire hydrants to dig out during snowstorms. So when it snows in Boston, the plows come down the street, all the fire hydrants get buried, and if there's a fire on that street, the first thing the firefighters must do is spend minutes digging out the fire hydrant before they can put the fire out. Meanwhile, there are citizens who live there who are doing nothing because they might be stuck home. Why not have them dig out a fire hydrant? So when you start thinking about your community as in it with you, these are the kinds of ideas that come up. So we took this tool and repurposed it in Oakland. Obviously, it doesn't snow in Oakland, and it doesn't rain that often either, which means when it does, the storm drains get clogged and they flood the streets. So we built Adopt a Drain, which allows citizens to adopt storm drains and to clean them out when it's going to rain. So I own one of these storm drains up here near the top of the map, and when it's going to rain, which it did last week, I got an email from the city saying, hey, it's about to rain, can you go check your storm drain and make sure it's cleaned out? And they'll give you like a little orange vest and trash pickers, so you can go out there and feel very official. And it takes, 5 minutes. Usually it's not clogged at all. But this is work now that 5 minutes does two things. One, it saves the city a lot of money of sending public works employees out to check all of the storm drains or to deal with them once the street is flooding. But the second thing, and probably the most important thing, is that it gives me this sense of ownership of my city, a collaboration with city government that makes me feel like I have more responsibility for the place that I live. And that builds trust. So another story from Code for America. This is maybe a little bit of a bigger task. We had a team working for the city of Honolulu a few years ago. They were building a website that made it easier for citizens to find clear and actionable answers to the city's most frequently asked questions. And I'm not sure when the last time any of you were on your city's website trying to find a piece of information, but it's not always the easiest, most straightforward process. So they decided that instead of writing the answers to the questions themselves, why not enlist the help of citizens? So they held a write-a-thon, sort of like a hackathon, but without the code, to create all the answers that would populate the website. And we again borrowed this concept in Oakland, and I took part in, this is what it looked like at the time. So these are just citizens of Honolulu who are working together, writing answers to these questions and populating the website that the city was going to host. We again borrowed this concept in Oakland. We took part in a write-a-thon, and it engendered this deep sense of community and ownership. And I'm not sure exactly how those acts of participation might translate in the museum context, and I bet many of you are already doing some of these things to engage your community. But the more you can think of your constituents as co-owners of your institutions with you, the more trust they will have. You will be surprised when you knit together these very small acts of participation, the kind of community it can engender over the long term. So to recap, you have to know your audience, you have to know who you're trying to reach, and importantly, who you're not reaching already. You must meet them on their terms. That means finding spaces that are safe for them and speaking to them in an authentic voice or with authentic ambassadors. You must have a conversation with them, and you must let it be two-way. And you must create meaningful opportunities for them to participate. Now, again, I think many of you are probably doing many of these things, even if you don't necessarily think of them in this framework. So I hope that all of you found something that you can take back and implement. But mostly, I want you guys to think of yourselves, again, not just as digital practitioners, but as networked organizers. And think about the role that you play in creating networked institutions that include and empower, and don't let the fearmongers and the demagogues win. Thank you.
I think that it's fascinating. You see things go this way, although some of our institutions themselves still, or maybe most of them, how many institutions still look like the hierarchical? So, what impact is that on how we work with the communities and how leadership works and everything, and how is that transition? I'm sure you don't have the answer on that, but just to start the dialogue on what that means as far as getting us there in who we all are, in our responsibility and our ownership and our leadership and that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I will say trying to do this kind of work inside institutions that are organized like this right now and have leadership that is resistant to change is really hard, and it takes a lot of emotional labor. It sounds like all of you are sort of in that position where you're trying to be the ones who are pushing the boundaries. So we had a lot of this frustration working in Code for America, where local government is absolutely run this way and is absolutely resistant to change. And, it gets easier. I can't say there's any sort of magic bullet, but you have to understand that the work you are doing is culture change, and it is the work of, many times of the kind of work that community organizers are doing. They're working laterally, they're trying to get buy-in from their staff, they're showing them what's possible, they're teaching, they're not preaching, they're trying to bring people along with them. So if you think of yourselves in that way and doing your job and not thinking of yourselves as sort of siloed into your one position, but trying to sort of bring people around you along, you are going to be one of the most important people in this new institution. And either the institution is going to change or it's going to go away. That's true. Now, how long that takes is a different question, but if you can make that case internally, then you're going to be much better off. It helps if you have good leadership, though.
A few questions. To what extent does this change, is it coherent with human nature? Mm-hmm. And also, can you point to some examples of where this change has been implemented and is working? So I'm thinking the things that come to my mind are like the California proposition system, or the new instant runoff voting that's going on in Maine, or things like this, things that are very, very fundamental and keystones of the change.
Are you a California voter?
I am.
You are?
I am.
And you think that the California proposition system is working?
Well, but you have to admit, it is not a central dominance, hierarchical, structured thing. So I'm pointing to that because one could argue that it is truly a distributed nomination system.
Yeah, and I guess, to be a little bit more nuanced about this picture, and actually in particular this picture, which was the Obama campaign's organizing structure, this was extremely structured, this model, right? And so, the balance in doing this kind of work is, I guess one end of the spectrum is sort of pure anarchy, and one end of the spectrum is pure dictatorship. You're trying to find the space in the middle that gives people enough freedom to sort of feel like they have ownership over the thing that you're doing without creating chaos, right? So everyone's got to be on the same page about the goal. You've got to have a story that everyone buys. I mean, hope and change and all of that branding was, everyone knew exactly what the talking points were. This structure was the same across the board, right? So everyone knew what their roles and responsibilities were. At the same time, you were able to take those fundamental building blocks that everyone was using and localize them, right? So what Hope and Change meant in Pennsylvania was different than what it meant in Florida, and organizers on the ground had a lot of leeway to translate that, right? So it's about finding that space where you've got enough agency to feel empowered and to run with it and to really give people a sense that they're they're doing something active and not passive, without letting, too much freedom is just going to overwhelm people, right? If they don't know what direction they're going in, if there's no sort of structure or goal, then it gets a little bit off the rails. So in California, for something that I would say that's a little bit more at the anarchy side of the spectrum, where anyone can get anything on the ballot, and then voters get a ballot that they're totally overwhelmed by and don't understand. Many of them avoid voting for a lot of the issues, and I'm not really sure that's the kind of thing we mean when we say decentralized. It is still highly structured and organized, and actually it means leadership in organizations that are networked is really important, maybe even more important than it was in the 20th century. It just looks very different. That's why leading from behind was a pejorative for Obama. That's exactly how a leader should be leading a networked institution.
Hi. Making better relationships with networked organizations often means bringing in people and making space for people who come from different backgrounds and outside our industry. And while we often know that that's totally necessary, it can also be very scary because a lot of times it means huge culture shifts within our own industry that can, make us fear for our own careers or our colleagues. How do you recommend making space to make that change that we know needs to happen?
Yes, I mean, that is very true. If you can get Todrick Hall to come work at your museum, I guarantee you'll have a more open and community-oriented institution. But again, like it comes down to leadership. If any of you are in leadership roles or hiring manager roles, I would encourage you to sort of think differently about the profile for people you're hiring. It's hard to say without knowing exactly what the constraints are within your given institution, but if you're thinking about, if you've set out the goal of we're moving into this new age, maybe the kinds of skills that you, or job requirements that you're writing for are going to change a little bit. Maybe you want someone who has community organizing experience. Maybe you want someone who can tell you a story about a time that they were able to bring people in to do some meaningful participation work. Maybe you want someone who can point to a way that they've grown a community over time. And those are the things that you start prioritizing in your recruiting over, the sort of you've done this job the way we envision it now before. Let's just take, have you make a lateral move over from this, the same industry in some other organization. So it takes a little bit of imagination. But honestly, I don't just say this because I'm a community organizer. I think these skills are the skills that organizations need in the future. And again, they are very, any good organizer is also going to be very good with digital tools because they have to be. They just are. They are the tool set for community organizing.
Hi, my question is about targeting and the hyper-targeting that you can do with the data that you get. I think all of us who are in marketing or in some position where we're looking at data to figure out who our audiences are know the power steering that affords. At the same time, this conference is a lot about access. And I wanted to know, in your experience, have you found that when the efforts went to hyper-target a population that you thought was convincible as voters, where something got missed? Because I feel like the data that we have is usually on who's coming to our institutions, and if we're talking about access and people who are not coming, they get absent of the data a lot of the times, and it's not easy to reach them, and a lot of us, because of our resources, have to go for low-hanging fruit, so it's to convert those who are already coming to encourage their peers to come. Mm-hmm. So I was wondering about if you've had any experiences where people got missed or populations got missed, and what did that look like?
Yeah, I think probably one of the most important, and when I said, this technological shift has created as much bad as it has good, probably one of the biggest issues we have to face in this new world is how bias gets embedded into data and algorithms. And it's very easy for us to look at numbers and think that they are objective, without realizing how the humans who are putting the numbers together are reflecting their implicit biases into the data itself, whether it's by excluding some people because you aren't able to collect data about them, or whether it's by putting weight on different factors than others. The one thing I could say that helps you get around this is to be transparent about how you're using the data. And hold it up for scrutiny. Ask people to tell you what you might be missing. And I guess that's another piece of this is sort of implicit in how you operate in these new networked organizations. You have to have a little bit more vulnerability and willingness to fail in public, and that requires transparency. And ultimately, it might feel bad in the moment, but will ultimately build trust.
Hi. A lot of times, I'm not a tech person, and so when I enter these spaces, I hear about a lot of projects that encourage participation from users of all kinds. And a lot of times, for me, again, as an outsider to this kind of culture, some of those experiences or modes of participation feel like they're not actually shifting power and who holds power. Mm-hmm. And to use your framework, maybe it's because there are a lot of hierarchical institutions that are beginning to use these kinds of strategies or tools for participation and to create some kind of sense of openness without it necessarily shifting the way the organization is operating in a core way. And then it feels disingenuous, and you feel like you don't trust those organizations, and you feel like, well, all of these tools are not really, offering the things that they're promising. I'm just wondering how you navigate that, and how you recommend that we navigated that as folks who are interested in bringing these tools to organizations that may still have a long way to go before they shift their core values and principles.
Yeah, and I mean, this is why I wanted to really focus on methodologies and approaches as opposed to tools, right? So the four that I talked about here could be facilitated with digital tools, or you could do these all offline. And I tried to make the point earlier that the thread that kind of runs from this 20th century to now is protest and organizing. The fundamentals of that have not changed, but the principles are still the same, and the promise that the internet brings to help enhance those kinds of values, because they're built on the same values, is really, really powerful. So it really is about getting the values right first, and then figuring out how the tools play into your strategy. It's not about looking at what tools are available and trying to slap them on top of the thing that you're already doing. That's always going to fail. It's like the e-ification of everything. So, e-government really just meant taking a paper form and putting it up on a website, which changed actually nothing about the process of interacting with government. So that's why you need to think about, what does it mean to actually break down an organization, make it more decentralized, open, collaborative, based in trust, transparent, and then you start to see where power starts to shift.
So you have your snowflake model up here. And I guess my question is, if you're the big teal dot in the middle, it's really easy to be able to change that structure if you're at the top of a hierarchical system. What tips could you recommend for the people who are all the way out on the outside to start this conversation? Because if you're on the outside, you clearly don't have influence over the overall model.
Actually, you have a lot of influence over the overall model. I think, again, and there aren't arrows here between the dots on the edge, but those arrows exist, and all of those people are able to talk to each other and organize with each other very easily, right? So if something is if the strategy is wrong and enough people believe that at the ground level, it's a lot easier in a structure like this to push that change up to the top.
I guess my question was more if this doesn't exist.
Oh.
So if you're starting with a hierarchical model, and this doesn't exist, but you're going to end up being that little blue dot, what techniques could you have for starting to transition over to this model? Okay.
Again, and I don't know this is a very satisfactory answer if you feel like the leadership in your organization isn't on board, but leadership is, again, super important in this structure. So really if you pulled this out into 3 dimensions, it both goes out, but it also goes up. So there is some hierarchy here. And the people at the top really do have to buy into the values as well, right? And they know that all of the people at the edges are doing basically the work that makes the organization run, and if those people aren't empowered, then the organization doesn't work. So a good organizer always delegates everything. It's the tagline on the campaign was delegate yourself out of a job. So you shouldn't have anything to do. Now, the staff organizer here, this was like the one that you're talking about, I think, is the blue dot in the middle. Is that?
Teal dot, yeah.
Okay. That person is the lowest paid staff person on a campaign. Everyone else out from this is a volunteer. So that role was like the most important role in the entire campaign. It was sort of where the more institutional structure of the campaign hit the grassroots part of the campaign. And so there's a lot of time and training that went into those field organizers. I don't really know, again, how you can make that part of it happen without there being some leadership and resources and mandate in place. But if you were able to make a compelling case that organizing yourself like this and being able to harness all this extra capacity from people who currently are underutilized in your community, then it's probably a compelling case to whoever is in charge of the budget or whatever, that this is a better way of making use of resources. If any of you are in a resource-constrained environment and are being asked to cut your budgets, this might be a great opportunity to come in and say, this is a way we could organize ourselves that gets us some cost savings without losing a lot of the capacity that we need to run this place. And then you're kind of like sneakily getting the methods in the door.
Thank you for bringing up the phone call issue. I'm one of those people who really wants to be unconvincible, because the do not call list seems to have been thrown away. And I keep getting, I've been barraged by phone calls, emails, and I'm just wondering if you have suggestions as to how to reach audiences in a really favorable way without making anybody angry, or, because I feel like we're just kind of barraged by information now. And what is a kind of a technique for using either the phone or email or social media to really gently get your message out without flooding?
Yeah, this is where, again, being able to speak to someone in a relevant voice and through a trusted ambassador many times becomes really important. Because you're so overwhelmed with information, it becomes really hard to pick out the signal from the noise, right? So first I want to just say, because we're in campaign season, if you are getting calls from phone bankers, please be nice to them. I was making calls last week, and I'll be going to Nevada this weekend, so I just want to get some good mojo going so no one yells at me. But email and phone and a door knock are still, despite, we're still in that transitionary period to where people are, moving into new channels of communication. So while you're excavating what might be new, you do still have to invest in some of the old methods as well, particularly because, back to the point about, why we're centralizing technology, there's a lot of people who we want to reach who are still most reachable through those other tactics. But one that is taking off right now and has actually been really successful this cycle, probably will start to replace email as the most effective way to reach people from a marketing perspective, is text message. And we've registered, there are several organizations that are now doing end-to-end voter registration through SMS, and have registered hundreds of thousands of voters this year. So it is an effective method. It's a little bit less intrusive, I think, than a phone call these days. But again, it really is understanding the variety of channels available to you, who's using those channels, who you're trying to reach via those channels, and who the most effective voice is going to be for them to hear from.